Hi, and welcome to this recording of a session I held last week at Tech Days in Sweden. We're now in November 2014, and sessions weren't recorded, so I'm doing this instead. What I'm going to talk about is creating UIs with XAML for universal apps. And I work at J-Way. We're a consultant company with covering all technologies, but I'm in the Microsoft team and doing foremost Windows Client. So when I am talking about we during the talk, I'll be referring to our Windows Client team because we have a lot of best practices that we try to follow. And my intention of this talk is to give you a smorgasbord of what you can do with Blend and XAML. And if you haven't done any XAML or Blend at all, it's probably going to be too fast for you. And if you've done a lot, you've probably seen most of it. But hopefully, most of you can get something good out of this. And what I want to talk about is first and foremost XAML in general and some history. Then I'm going to go through some Blend basics. Then to the more advanced and everyday stuff that you do using styles and templates. Then the more fun stuff with visual states and animations. And lastly, I'm going to cover some universal apps and the limitations that we see there. So jumping into XAML. XAML came out with WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation, in 2006, and it has then evolved into first Silverlight, the cross-platform web framework, a little more lightweight than WPF. And when Windows Phone first came out, it was Silverlight that it used. But after that, with Windows 8, came the Windows XAML stack, which is a new stack in another namespace, which is based upon Windows RT compared to the .NET framework that the old ones were. But it's important to know the distinction that even if you have a Silverlight Windows Phone app that has been 7.x going to 8.0, you can then upgrade that to Windows Phone 8.1 and still be on the Silverlight stack. And that gives you the ability to use a lot of the WinRT APIs, but still be on the Silverlight stack. There are still some things that you cannot do on the Windows XAML stack. For example, a Windows Phone app cannot be a camera lens, and some other limitations. But Windows XAML is the new XAML stack that is used for 8.1 going forward, used for universal apps, so that's what you should be focusing on if you don't have any specific needs. So jumping into Blend. Blend can do most of what Visual Studio can do regarding UI creation, but also has some unique features. But it also has some limitations. So let's start looking at this. What it does have that Visual Studio also has is a simple solution explorer. You can look at your files. It does not have, for example, NuGet integration, but it has an object timeline where you can view the visual tree, which you also can in Visual Studio. And to the right you have all the properties that you can set. The unique stuff with Blend is to the top left you can handle visual states, which is a very powerful tool. And to the bottom left you have the storyboarding, where you handcraft and detail control your animations. And to the top right you have one resources tab and also the data tab, where you can create sample data. All this is unique to Blend currently. It's important to state that with Visual Studio 2015, Blend and Visual Studio are going to be almost the same application. So everything that you'll see today applies to both Visual Studio and Blend in 2015. So all the tips and tricks and stuff you can do there too. But the limitations that I talk about will probably be erased by then. So jumping into design data. As you are probably aware, when you use the model view model pattern and create UIs, you have them connected to some kind of data that drives the view. And that connection is called data bindings. And the view binds to some kind of data context. And to have a very real-life representative data context when you're designing is very important. And Blend has great tools for creating design data. You can either use a class that you just have in your project that's newing up stuff in the constructor, but you can also generate sample data either from scratch, or you can use a class as a template for what data should be created. We'll see this in the demo. And one thing that I really want you to have a look at is FODI. As you're probably all aware, for something to bind to the view, it has to implement the interface iNotify property changed. And there are 100 of ways to implement this interface. But there's a project called FODI that has IL weavers that injects code at build time. And with this, you can just either have plain properties and inherit from the interface, or you can decorate your classes with the attributes, and then FODI will handle everything and implement the interface iNotify property change. So you don't have to do all the boilerplate code of calling that the property has changed in the setters of the properties. Check it out if you want to get rid of writing unnecessary code. And now something I think is important. When you do coding, as most of us do, you often, or I at least, I really like to use the keyboard, not use the mouse, learn all the shortcut commands, put pride in creating nice, readable code, etc. But that is when you're developing. When you go to Blend, I want you to more think of yourself as a designer that's using the mouse. You don't care that much about what code is created, you only care about the UI that is creating. Because Blend is a tool that generates code, because XAML is code. So you shouldn't really care about exactly what it's creating, but try to Blend is built for using the mouse, so try to use the mouse as much as you can. And if you feel like going into XAML and just change something, really try to find a way to do this with the mouse in Blend instead. With that, I want to jump into the first demo. I'm just going to create a basic layout of a title and a button. So I'm jumping to Visual Studio. We have a universal app. I'm creating a blank. So I'm just going to create a Windows app to not get you too confused creating this. And now it's starting up. Just checking the recording. Seems like it's recording. Good. Okay, so we have an app, and I'm just going to walk you through the UI of Blend. To the left here is the toolbox, and under each section you can hold the mouse and see what sibling controls you can create. And here we have the Solution Explorer with your projects. Under Assets we have a lot of stuff. I don't think you have this in Visual Studio either. Under the project we have some image assets. We have the controls we can use. And we also have behaviors that we're going to talk about later. And here the visual states are empty because we're not in a control that has states. And in the device tab you can control what kind of device the designer emulates. And this is also very useful for making sure your app looks good on all kinds of devices and resolutions. And over here to the right we have the Properties tab. Nothing showing right now because nothing is selected. Under the Resources tab we can see and edit and move around all the resources that exist in our project. I'm going to see more of this later. And here we have the Data tab where you can create sample data. Going to see more of that. And down here is the visual tree. You see that it has a top and bottom app bar and a grid currently. So I'm going to jump out of the zoom mode, and I'm going to start by adding to this grid. There are some nice visual tools nowadays to just create rows. Setting this to be pixel width of 100. This one too, pixel width please, 100. I'm going to create a row. Pixel width please. Oops, undo. 150. Then I'm going to create another one that I'm setting to auto. And we now have a basic layout. I'm going to take a text block, I'm going to drag it up here. I'm going to have a button. That's in the same category as checkboxes, comma boxes, etc. But now I want a button. Put it up here. And now for these two, when I drag them as I just did, they get put in the correct column, row and column in the grid. That's nice. But now I want to reset the layout because I don't want them with the sizes and widths and margins that I just gave them. And I want them both bottom aligned. Take the button, making it right aligned. The text can have a much larger font so we can see it. That's nice. Now I want to see if this resizes correctly, so I'm going to stay here on the Devices tab, and I'm going to say that I want the app to be layout on the left side. And then I get this designer thing that it's just controlling the designer layout. I think this looks good. Nice. But now I created an extra row that I really don't want and set it to auto. And it can be a bit tricky to find it here. And going out here in the properties, I know that it's under the layout section and under the more advanced stuff if I would have selected the grid. If you don't know that, you can just type here and say I'm looking for the row definitions, and you will find it. You can go in here and you can edit rows. But what I want to do now is instead I want to show you how this can be done in Visual Studio. So I'm going to open Visual Studio. So now we have the designer open, same app in Visual Studio. And you can see the XAML down here, and on top of the XAML there are a few combo boxes. That is an element and member drill down. And if I click here, I get the parents and children of the current context of the visual tree. So what I can do is I can click on the grid, and then it drills down and give me the row definitions. And here I can easily see the rows that are defined. And of course it's going to zoom into the XAML as well. And when I selected this middle row that I know is the wrong one, out here to the right I have the sizings of it, so I can easily change it to star, which will make it appear, and then I can use these nice controls to delete the row because I don't want it. Nice. Okay, so what we now have is text block and button. What I want to do is I want this button to have, you can see you can do some useful things in Visual Studio too. I want to have a nice blue color, but then I want to reuse this color, so I'm going to create a new resource from this, and app blue color. We like to prefix all our styles and resources with app so that we know that it's something that we created. But that makes a resource of the color. Then I'm actually also going to create a resource of the brush. App blue brush. Like that. Nice. And if we look at the XAML, you can see that it has created the resources on the page. We have a color, and then we have a brush that's using the color. And some controls, when you style them, they want a color and some want a brush. So it's a good practice to always create a brush and a color, and the color is the one that holds the actual color. But now I want to switch back to blend, load up the things, and we have our color here. And now we created a very static UI, but now I want it to start showing real data. What I want to do now is add an existing project that I have created already. It's blend. And this project has some services and first and foremost some view models. So it has a main page view model and an item. So we've added the project. We're going to reference it. And what we can do now is we can go to the Data tab, and we can say that I want to create new sample data from a class, and I want it to be from my main page view model. And this just magically creates an XML structure using the properties that you had in your view model. And as you can see, it drills down into my custom view model items, creates data for those, and everything. So now if we go back to my main page, now I want the page to bind to this data. And there's a concept called a design time data context. I'm going to set it to this sample data. This is going to connect the view, and if we just quickly look at the SAML, you're going to see that it has a d::, data context element. And d:: is something that is just for design time. It's not going to be compiled into runtime. So now we've connected the view. It has its data context, and I'm going to just drag the title up to the text block, and boom, we have a title that's bound to the data. If we try to run the app now, it's going to start on my machine, and it has the button, but the text is not there because we don't have a runtime data context, but that's fine. And Blend is good for running the app too, but it never runs with debugging. So if you have weird errors, you have to switch to Visual Studio to debug those. But it's good for just running and testing the app. But now we see that the title is way too long, so I'm gonna remove this search, and I'm gonna set the wrap, text wrapping to no wrap. Okay, very nice. You also see that the text is covering the button, so we have to mark these two, and I actually want to group them into a grid. Creates a grid with these two. And I'm going to reset the layout of the grid. You never know if it's going to get margins and stuff. Reset the layout of these guys. I'm going to give the grid the bottom alignment instead. The button I'm putting in a new column. That's auto. Button is in column 1. Text block should not have a call span, which it does. Resets. Nice. And now it's not covering, but I also want the text to have text trimming to char ellipsis. It's going to trim the text. Maybe you don't want that. The Metro design language says that you probably shouldn't, but it could be nice sometimes to have that. Alright, so we have a basic design. It's bound to the view. I'm done. Let's go back to the slides. So now we've just done the basics of setting properties and arranging things. Now I want to go into the more detailed stuff. And we start with styles. Styles are a collection of properties that can be reused across your app. And they can also be inheriting from other styles, as you see with the based on attribute. And that gives you great flexibility in creating styles that are common, but still just inherit values from each other. And if you don't have a based on, it's a new style. If you remove the key, it becomes a generic style. So if you, for example, create a button style, and you remove the key and you put it under the app's resources in XAML, it's going to apply to all the buttons in the entire app. And that can be very powerful. And there are also a bunch of built-in styles that you can access for text blocks and everything. And that's why I like to prefix ours with app, so that we know that it's something that we created. Otherwise it's very easy to lose them in the pool of styles. There are color hints in Blend and Visual Studio to show where a setter for a property is coming from. So it's this little box next to the setter, and if it's gray, it's just a default value. If it's white, it's a local value that has been set on this element. If it's green, the value is set to a static resource somewhere, or a resource. And if it's yellow-orange, it's bound. Could be a data binding, could be a template binding. And if it's blue, it's an ambient value. And that means that it's coming from a custom resource. Oh, sorry, a custom style. And it's inheriting the value from that. Now if you jump into templates, controls in WPF and everything is in its essence lookless. It only has behavior. So for example, a button has a click event and it has some behavior that belongs to the button. And then it has a default template of what it should look like. And if we look at the default template that you see on the screen now, it's a grid with a border and then a content presenter that's going to present the content that is set on the button. And of course we can just restyle this any way we want. So if I extract a template and start changing it, I can as easily create a template that is a grid. It has an ellipse and it has the content presenter, but I've rotated it a bit. And then the button's going to look at this, and if I give it an image, that image is going to be rotated just as the text is now. Something very useful in Blend is the controls for jumping in and out of contexts. So if we take the example of being in the visual tree, you have a list view and you want to edit the template of that list view. That's going to take you into this if I edit it, it's going to create a style, and within that style is going to be a template. And then we have the breadcrumbs that it sits on top of the designer window. It's going to show you exactly where you are and the hierarchy of where you are. And then we have a small arrow in the object tree that you can jump out of the scope that you're in, because right now we're in the data template. And then that is the breadcrumbs are going to show you that you've been here, but you now have exited this state. And if you click on the style or template in the breadcrumbs, you're going to quickly switch back into where you just were. So it can be a very powerful tool to jump back and forth between contexts of templates and styles. And the resource handling in Blend is currently a lot better than Visual Studio. As you saw earlier in the demo, we created styles in Visual Studio, but to handle them, to move them around, to rename them, to edit them is much better in Blend. I'm going to see more of that. And the good things that Visual Studio have regarding this is first the element drill down that I showed you in the demo. Next one is that you can pull and drag things from the toolbox straight down to the document outline in Visual Studio. You cannot do that in Blend. You have to either double click and they will be added to the tree exactly where you are, or you have to drag them to the designer surface. And Visual Studio also has full IntelliSense in the XAML. That is coming in 2015 to Blend, but currently there are no code or XAML IntelliSense in Blend. Now I want you to stand up and be energized for my next demo. Okay, demo number 2, templates. We're going to template the button, and then we're going to create a grid view that has an item template that we're going to be styling. So let's jump right into it. We are back in Blend. What I want to start with is organizing this a bit. We have the title text that I set some color and size on, but instead I want to use a system style for this. I'm going to use the title style. And you see it's keeping some of my values, the colors, etc., but then it's also applying the style. But I want to change this. I'm going to edit a copy of it. I'm going to call it app header text box style. And now the context which I'm in changed the text block style. You can also see the breadcrumbs up here, text block, and I'm editing the style of it. So I want this style to use the blue brush. I want the text wrapping as we had before. I want it to be no wrap. Nice. And then I'm jumping out of this style, and let's look at this text block. Zoom in so you can see. You can see that this foreground is ambient now. Nice. It's coming from the style. We have text is bound. We have the font size is set on this. It's local. But I don't want it because I want to reuse this. So I'm going to reset it. And then we have blue, 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 blue. And we have the trimming that's also local. I'm going to skip that so that everything comes from the style instead. And now we see that the font size was not that big. So I'm going to jump back into the style. And I want to change the font size to something bigger. That's nice. And we jump out. And now we have a title text that's coming from the style instead. So now in the page we have some color resources and text style resources. So what I want to do is I'm going to organize this a bit more. I'm going to add a resource. I'm going to add a folder first. Add a new folder called themes. So this I'm adding a resource dictionary and I'm calling it colors. I'm also adding a resource dictionary called text styles. And now I'm going to go back to my main page. We see that what I'll do now is I'm going to move my color to colors. Moving the brush up there too. Change the order so we don't get any errors. And then I want my text block styles to be in text styles. Beautiful. So now I have styles that are in separate resource dictionaries, a bit more organized, a bit easier to overlook, and I can reuse them on any page in this app. Starting to get happy. But now I want to jump into the button. So we have a simple button with its default looks, and of course you can just, for example, take a rectangle. You can drag the rectangle into the button, and the content of the button is set to the rectangle instead. So the button can contain anything as its content. But now I'm just going to break the rule and jump into the XAML. First I'm going to just remove all this stuff. But I'm also going to change this to a symbol icon. This little trick for getting the nice default icons that exist on Windows. So now that I set it to a symbol icon, I get a nice drop down here where I can select just about any of the built-in icons that exist. You see there are icons for almost anything. Put the microphone there, jump out. So we have a symbol icon and the button uses this. But now I want to change the actual looks of this button. So I'm going to edit a template. I'm going to edit a copy of the template. I'm going to call it, it's my app button style. I can put it anywhere. I can put it in the resource dictionaries or in the application. Let's just put it in the application. So we have a button, and it has a grid, it has a border, and it has a content presenter. So what I'm going to start with doing is this border. I'm going to give it some corner radius. If you don't like round corners, you can just give it some more corner radius and maybe give it a fixed size so that we get a round button. Nice. And then with this content presenter, we can do what we want with this. I can set the opacity to something if I want it to be almost not visible. But now I'm gonna go to the transforms, angle, flipping, up, down. So I flipped it up and down. So this of course applies to anything that gets put in the button. If I reset the content of it, reset, and just type button high instead, text is going to be up and upside down. But let's undo that so we get the microphone. Okay, but now this template and style is set on the button itself. But what I want to try is I want to go to resources. You can see under app we have our app button style. I can click here to edit it. Give me the style. Jump into the XAML. If I now remove the key and jump back to main page, I'm on the button. It has a style which I can reset. Did it get reset? I'll reset the style. Yes, it is reset. And a bug sometimes gives control the user interface. But now you see it has a margin, it has a grid, and it has a symbol icon, but it still has the round looks and template because it's defined in the app on a global level. Nice, the button is styled. What I want to do now is, in the data we had a main page view model with a list of items. So I want to start by creating a grid view. I'm going to put it in this grid down here. Nice. And if I take my items and pull in here, set the layouts. Blend will have created a default template for all the items. Maybe this template is not exactly what I want, but we can of course easily edit it. So looking at the grid view, we now compared to the button have a lot more templates to play with. We have the template for the grid view itself. Then we have some additional templates. And here we have an item template. That is what Visual Studio or Blend is creating for each item in the data source that it has. We have a container style, which is what the grid view will create to contain each of these items. We have an items panel that the system will use to lay out the items. It can be a list, a stack panel, a grid. And then we have a footer and a header. So now I want to jump into the item template. I want to edit it. And this will bring me into context to just one of the items. And you see here it has created a border with an image and 2 text blocks. So what I'm going to do is, I'm already on the data tab. I'm going to take the title, pull it to the top text. I'm going to take the date, put it to the bottom text. Then I'm going to go and right align that bottom text, not that one, the bottom text please. Thank you. And in the sample data that has been created, we only have text types. But a very nice thing is that I can easily change the data that is being created. I can, for example, say that this title field should be formatted as an email address. And then we're going to get email addresses for all the data. Or I'm going to say that it's going to be a website URL. It's going to be URL. But as you can see, we only have text types here. So if I want, for example, an image, I have to either go in and edit the sample data. I can do that manually. Or we can go here and create a new sample data that we create from scratch. And there we have image types to select from. But what I want to do now instead, I want to use a class. So I want to put myself, jump out of the context, go to the page. I want to tell this page that I want you to use the design time data context of a design instance. And a pattern that we like to use is to have a class inherit from our view model and call it the same name but sample data, and then just new up a bunch of sample data in the constructor. And then we'll have a class that we have full control over that will modify itself with our code changes, and it has some data. So now we have the data context the same type of object, but we have a new data. You see the text are different, and the image URL that I have, that's the grid view. I want to jump into context here. Go to the grid view. We have a border within the template. We have an image, and I want this image to be bound to the source of the image. And now I simply have, let me show you this in Visual Studio. We have our main page view model, which has in it some stuff. And then we have a main page view model sample data that inherits from main page, and it just creates a bunch of items. And I have some image URIs in there. We move back to blend, and we see that the default template already put our image inside of a border. And that's a nice feature, because when you have an image, you can stretch it differently. You can either set stretching to none, which is often not that useful. You can set it to fill, which will just use all the space but not keep the proportions. You can have it as uniform, but it's not going to fill. And then you can have uniform to fill. But look at Tom Cruise now. He jumps to the right because the image is just going to be top left aligned. So when you put it inside a border, you can set the image to be centered, especially if it doesn't have any size. And now compared to being stretch and center, the image is going to be centered. Very nice, centered within the border. And now I'm in the item template, and I don't want this to have a fixed size either, so I'm going to just remove this. Nice. But I'm going to show you something regarding margins and the container style. Now I'm in the template of what the grid view creates for each item, and I'm going to give this remove this margin. And give it a big hefty bottom margin of 50. Okay? We want some spacing. But then I'm going to jump out, and for the grid view, I'm going to edit the container style. Edit a copy. Call it app, grid view item style. And now I'm editing the template that surrounds each item. But it just has a grid view item presenter. It's not that exciting. So I'm going to jump out of this and instead jump to the style that is holding this template. And this has some more interesting things. We have some margin, and I'm going to give it a big hefty right margin. Now we have some even more spacing. This is nice. So now we have some spacing of the items. And I'm also going to, in this, I'm actually going to set it to some bigger width to show you yet another problem. And I'm going to show you how to solve it. 350. I want the items to be 350. We set some margins. If I run it now, we're not going to have any data because we only have design time data. So what I want to do is I want to jump to Visual Studio, and in the main page of this app, jump to the code. I'm going to override the unnavigated to. And here comes another beauty of having the design time data in a normal class is that I can just new this up here if I want runtime data before I have any real runtime data. So I'm just setting the data context in a navigator too. We'll jump back to blend. Make sure we save. Run it. Did I run it? I'll run it again. Blend is waiting for me. We'll run in Studio and see what happens. Run it. And we get our items. The horizontal stretching is a bit funny, but we have items, and if I hover here, you will see that the selection area includes the bottom margin that was a part of the item template, but it does not include the container style margin, the 40 margin that is to the right. So that you should really pay attention to what you're doing in the item template compared to the container style. But now the horizontal stretching is way off. You see, it's centered, and the text here stops right there. It's only using the width that it has. Button is there. Okay, so I'm going to stop this, go back to Blend. Is it working? No, it's not working. Well, it's saved. So I'm going to do this. Let's do Blend. Where are you? Details. Blend. Sorry, Blend. You gotta go. Go to the studio. We open Blend. Opening Blend. As you might remember, on the item template, I removed the width. So the item template itself doesn't have any width. And if we look at the grid view, we can set some kind of horizontal alignment on the grid view. We can set the horizontal content alignment. Whoa, they're centered. So I'm going to center this. Oh, that doesn't help. But that's just because we don't have any content on the grid view itself. But we can jump into the item template to just show you that we have an item. We're going to look at the XAML. You see we have an item template. It has margin. The border has some width. That's nice. But it has nothing else. So now we jump to the container style instead. Current. Here we see the bottom margin of 40. The right margin of 40, sorry. And if we look over here, I'm going to close the XAML. We're supposed to look at that. We look at the style. We scroll down here and we see that horizontal content alignment of this is centered. If we would have created this style and template from scratch, these would have been template bound to the content alignment, and that wouldn't have worked either. But the trick is you have to go into the container style and set it to stretch. And this will make your item stretch. Vertical doesn't do that much, but now we can run it. We will hopefully see nice runtime sizes. Yes, and you see the margin is still there. That does it for demo number 2. Now to the fun part. Visual states are visual states that you can have on controls. This, now we're looking at a button, and it has states for normal, pressed, mouse over, etc. And what you can do is you can define state groups that are mutually exclusive, the states within those. You can have visual states, you can have transitions between them where you can set the animations. And to the top left you have 2 very subtle buttons, but that controls how Blend is recording when you do modifications to your objects. So one will change, for example, the margins when you move something around, and the other one will create, the one to the right will create a render transform instead. And that is what you want to use most of the time, because first of all it's better for the layout engines. You just have to redraw things, and also they can be animated when you use transforms. I'll show you that soon. And animations, I just want to show you a quick video. Pay attention. just thought this was a nice addition to the app, that the splash screen has the logo in one position, and then it just animates it with a storyboard up to the top where it sits on the panorama. And these small little touches are the things that makes your app go from good to great. So you should really try to get those in when your app is complete and it's working. And to control animations in details, you have storyboarding. You can set timelines and do almost anything. Paths can also be very powerful to just create drawings of any shape or form. I'm going to show you more of that. But here you really don't want to look at the code that it's generating. You can, but it gets very icky quickly. And behaviors is another concept that we haven't talked about yet, and that is that you can develop behaviors in code that does something, and then you can in Blend, without touching code, create UIs that have behavior. So for example, there's a call method action that will call a method. It's a control storyboard action that will control a storyboard. So you can trigger things, you can start animations, you can go to a visual state with the go to state action. I'm going to show you one of these soon. So let's look at this. I'm going to create a small drawing and I'm going to animate it, but I'm also going to do some modifications to the button. So back in Blend, I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to start with the button, zoom in, and we take the button, we edit its templates, because it's here that we have the visual states of the button. See, we have two groups. We have common states and focus states. I'm just going to touch the states within the common. So we have the normal states, we have pressed, we have disabled, and we have pointer over. And you see when I click on one of these states, Blend goes into recording mode, so it's going to just record everything that I do. So for pointer over, I'm going to have our border here resize itself a bit. So when I put the pointer over, I'm going to blow it up to twice the size. Nice. That's really nice. And when I press it, I want it to be the same size as with pointer over, but I want to make sure I have the render transform mode up here. And then I want to just move this a bit. Could I not? I want to move it, man. There. So I moved it as a render transform. And so now we have the normal states, we have base, normal, pressed, disabled, pointer over. That looks good. But I want to add an animation to this. I want, when you go from, not from pressed, but when you go from pointer over to pressed, I want you to, during half a second, to put on an animation, maybe something crazy, something elastic. Let's do it like this. So it's going to use this animation when going from pointer over to pressed. Great, let's run and see how this looks. I'm going to zoom it in for you. Okay, so mouse over, what does that do? Blows it up. Pressed, uses an animation to go to the other states. So these visual states can be very, very powerful. And often when you have several different states and you want the UI to be able to transform between any of them back and forth, it can get very icky if you just use storyboards to control the animations. Visual states are much more powerful. And you can also use visual states for handling responding to different sizes of apps, which will be very useful when you do universal apps that are supposed to run on both phone and small tablets and large Windows screens. So that was it for the button. I'm going to go to creating a path. Let me zoom out a bit. Let's start with an ellipse. let's create it. Yeah, let's create it up here. We have an ellipse. Zoom in. And then I'm going to do a pen. I'm going to draw something here. I'm going to draw something else. Like that. I'm going to take this ellipse. I'm going to convert it into a path. I'm going to take these three paths and combine them into with subtract, something almost scary. And then maybe to create a Halloween theme, I'm going to make it, that's not right, almost orange. Alright, so we created a path that we can do whatever we want with, but what I want to do now is I want to create a storyboard. Let's create a new storyboard. Okay, I'll go away from the app prefixing right now. Let's draw this to the side. That was hard. Okay, so we have our path, and what are we going to do? I'm going to, in half a second, I'm going to make it rotate. I can use the mouse scroll wheel to just scroll up. And after a second, I want it to be back. I want the angle to be back, please. Rotation, angle, back, boom. Great. And then just moving forward, I want the angle to be a bit higher. Moving forward, go up again. Forward, down again. Up again. But then I want you to go to angle 0. Didn't quite work. 0. And then I want to sit there until 3 seconds. Go. Great. I can preview the storyboard here. yeah. That's funny. If I click the storyboard here, I get some properties to the right, so I can tell it to repeat forever. Nice. But now I want to trigger this somehow. So what I want is, I want this path to get a behavior, and we want to control the storyboard. Double click it. It's going to actually add two behaviors to this mix. Probably should exit the recording mode. Let's see how this turns out. So first of all, we have an event trigger behavior. So I want to trigger on the tapped event of this path. And what I want to do is control the storyboard story1, and I want it to play. So I'm creating behaviors using nothing but blend. Let's run. And it starts, it runs, and it repeats forever. That does it for the demos. Maybe I should just shut that down. So going into universal apps, what you've seen now so far has only been a Windows app. And almost everything that I've shown also applies to universal apps. Universal apps is the convergence of the Windows platform, and back in the day when we had Windows Phone 7, it was a completely different stack. We had the Windows Phone running on .NET Compact Framework with Silverlight, and then came Windows 8, and Windows Phone 8 still was on Silverlight but could use some of the Windows RT APIs. And with Windows 8.1 and Universal Apps, it's all converging so that Windows Phone 8 can use the same XAML stack as Windows 8.1, and Windows 10 is around the corner, which will blend everything together. It's an exciting future that we have in front of us. So if we look at a universal app, it uses a new concept called a shared project. And the shared is basically an automatic way of linking files into the projects. So here we have a universal apps. It's a Windows app, it's a phone app. They are two separate apps, going to be built as two separate packages. But everything in the shared project is also going to be included in the two different apps. So it's basically the same thing as doing linking of files. But Visual Studio and also Blend, but most of foremost Visual Studio has a lot of tools for this. When you are in a shared file, both a XAML or a C#, you always have a context of what of the end apps you are viewing the code as. Because for example, you want to handle the physical back button of Windows Phone. Thought I was going to show that. You're going to have to handle that, and you have to handle it in the code, so you have some strategies for sharing that code. And now that we have a common XAML stack that can be used on both phone and Windows, it's important to know that most of the controls, for example a button, they look the same and they behave the same on both systems. Then there are some controls, for example the date and time pickers, that they act the same. You can have it in shared XAML, but they're going to render differently on Windows and phone. And then we have some even more specialized controls. For example, the pivot exists only on Windows Phone and not on Windows. And the hub control exists on both, but it replaces the panorama. So on Windows Phone, it becomes a panorama that is circular and you can eternally swipe sideways. But on Windows, it's the classic Windows start screen that just slides from left to right and then stops at the ends. But you can have the same XAML on both platforms, which is very cool. And to share code and share XAML, there are a few techniques. To share the code, you can do it with if-defs, because the phone and Windows apps will have predefined compile constants. You can also do partial classes, but we like to use more of, for small things we like to use as the example as you see on the screen, you just switch in code. But if you have bigger behavior that you want to control, it's nice to use normal code patterns such as inheritance, dependency injection, and inject classes that do different things. And then for sharing your XAML, this is where it becomes very interesting. You can share all your XAML and have it in shared, or you can have XAML files in each of the app projects but have the actual code behind file in your shared. You could also, for example, have a holder page that has the basic layouts, and then you can, from that shared page, use user controls that is defined in each of the app projects. So there are a lot of ways to tackle code and XAML sharing. But there are some limitations too. For example, just looking at a normal button, when you edit a template, the template, you cannot from a shared project edit a copy of the template. That is because the button is defined differently on both of the platforms. So if you, for example, want to create a custom button that you have in your shared XAML, you have to extract the template in a XAML file in each of the specific applications and create the style and template there. And then you can just use it in the shared XAML. But it doesn't come from the same template. And also you can't create sample data from a class that I showed you in the demo. You cannot use that for things that are in the shared project. You have to be in the app projects. So to summarize and recap some of the tips, just small tips. What I've been using a lot is grouping into and changing layout type. That can be very powerful when you want to just, you have a few text blocks that you want to either put in a common control, or you want to change the layout from a grid to stack panel, or you want to ungroup them so that they lie in the parent structure instead. Reset all on the layout. You should use a lot to not have unpleasant surprises. There are good design tools. The bottom left, we can see what the app looks like in different sizes and shapes. And then the last two are the context and breadcrumbs of knowing where you are in the styling and being able to quickly jump back and forth between them. And just some tips and tricks from my team. We like to prefix our styles and everything with apps so that we can easily distinguish them. We like to use the sample data method of creating our own sample data in classes. So we have full control and can use them in runtime, etc. And then we like to have a naming convention for the view model, so that we have a view model is suffixed with VM, and a page is always called a main page view model, and then for items that are displayed in lists, etc., we suffix them with VMI view model item. And then the last thing is FODI. Look it up and you will love it. What I want to leave you with today is the best practices. Doing blend, I want you to try and use the mouse. There's often a good way to do the thing that you want with the mouse. I want you to structure your resources just as you structure your code when you code. You don't want a big ass class with 100 methods. You want to have the methods that go together in a class, and you want to separate the concerns, etc. The same thing with your resources. Even if you don't want to look at your XAML, it's just nice to have them resources. When you want to look at your XAML for your resources, it's golden to have them structured in resource dictionaries. I want you to really learn in visual states, because that can be useful for a lot of things, both for just controlling UI as things happen in your app, or responding to different sizes of the app. And the last thing, use design data. It's important to have design data, and not only have it, but also create design data that is representative of the real world. As you saw in my example, I had a very long title that made me change the layout of the button and title on the top. And if you spend some time on creating sample data that is long, short, and all of the differences that you can see in real world, it will be better for you. So, thanks a lot for listening. You're more than welcome to contact me if you have questions, feedback, anything. Have a nice day.